He spent the whole hearing tearing Karoline Leavitt down, mocking her, questioning her character, and tried to break her in front of a crowd. But before he could finish, federal agents walked in and put him in handcuffs. Karoline Leavitt stepped out of a black Ford Explorer onto the slushy curb of Chestnut Street in Manchester, New Hampshire. The cold bit at her cheeks, but she didn't flinch. Cameras were already rolling, and local news vans lined the sidewalk like vultures waiting for a headline. She wasn't new to pressure, but this morning, something felt different. This was supposed to be minor. A complaint tied to a speech she gave last fall at a veterans fundraiser. One sentence, taken out of context, was now being twisted into a supposed violation of state campaign ethics law. Her lawyers argued it was a stretch, an attempt to discredit her. She had spoken candidly, without a script, as she always did. Someone had filed an official complaint, and the court had taken it seriously enough to schedule a hearing, but no one in her camp believed it would amount to anything. Karoline adjusted her navy coat and pushed through the glass doors of the courthouse, flanked by her attorney, Alan Dorsey. Alan was calm, the kind of man who never raised his voice, even when provoked. They had reviewed everything. The paperwork was clean, the timeline solid. They were confident. But as they walked into courtroom 4B, it became clear this wouldn't be the routine procedural morning they had anticipated. Judge Ronald Marks entered 5 minutes late, his robe half-buttoned, a worn leather notebook under his arm. He didn't acknowledge the room, just sat down, adjusted his microphone, and flipped through a few papers. Karoline had seen him before, on television mostly, a former federal prosecutor turned Superior Court judge, known for being blunt and unfiltered. He had a strange kind of celebrity status in certain circles, particularly progressive legal forums and a few national cable segments. Some praised him as a bold voice against corruption, while others quietly questioned his handling of political cases, especially those involving conservatives. That morning, she realized which version of him had shown up. "Let's move this along," he said, eyes still on the file. Karoline stepped forward. "What we're reviewing today," Marks continued, "isn't just a matter of paperwork. It's a matter of judgment, yours." He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Frankly, I'm struggling to understand why you thought your remarks at a veterans event were remotely appropriate." Karoline remained silent. Alan started to object, but Marks held up a hand, silencing him with a glance. "Is this about ethics?" Marks mused, though it wasn't clear if he was asking anyone in particular. Or is it about how far some people are willing to go to stay in the public eye, even if that means poisoning civic discourse? A few people in the room shifted uncomfortably. The stenographer hesitated, then continued typing. Alan leaned in to whisper something, but Karoline remained still. She could feel it. This wasn't about that speech. This was personal. Marks went on, raising his voice just enough to ensure the media caught every word. "Your generation thinks politics is a performance, that speaking louder means speaking truth. I'm not impressed by that, and I'm even less impressed by your sudden rise to prominence." The courtroom had turned into a stage, with no real legal structure guiding the hearing. Just one man on a mission. Finally, Karoline spoke. "Your Honor, are we discussing the complaint, or are you giving a public critique of my career?" Mark smirked, leaning back. "Well, Ms. Leavitt, sometimes the two are the same thing." The room fell silent for a moment. Alan stood and formally motioned to redirect the hearing back to its intended focus. Marks ignored him. This wasn't a courtroom anymore. It was something else entirely. But just as things seemed to spiral further, the door at the back of the room creaked open. At first, no one reacted. Their focus remained locked on Judge Marks, who still controlled the scene. A court officer slipped inside, quietly shutting the door behind him and taking position at the rear. No one paid him much mind. Up front, Karoline stood firm. Judge Marks tapped his pen against the bench in slow, deliberate beats. "Let's talk about character," he said. "That seems to be the word people use when they describe you. Strong character, bold voice, a fighter. I believe one of your supporters wrote that in an op-ed. But what I want to know, Ms. Leavitt, is this: where was that so-called bold character when you accused elected officials of betraying our country at a campaign fundraiser? Did you think no one would notice? Or did you assume your youth gave you immunity?" Alan leaned forward, his voice firmer this time. Your Honor, respectfully, that's a misleading interpretation of her statement. The full context. I've read the transcript, Marks interrupted, snapping his fingers against the bench. And frankly, if you believe a statement like that doesn't carry serious implications, maybe you shouldn't be representing anyone. The room tensed. Karoline's cheeks flushed, but she didn't waver. I stand by what I said, she replied. I was addressing veterans, men and women who have actually sacrificed for this country. My words were blunt because the truth often is. Marks chuckled. The truth, huh? Or was it just a way to rile up donors? A gasp rippled through the gallery. A few phones were quietly lifted, attempting to capture the moment despite the court's strict no-recording policy. A reporter furiously scribbled in her notepad. This wasn't just about Karoline anymore. It was about a judge using his seat to create a spectacle, and everyone in the room could feel it. Allen stepped forward again. Your Honor, I'm filing a motion to postpone this hearing on the grounds of judicial bias. Marks waved a hand dismissively, as if swatting away a fly. Denied. You don't get to cry bias just because someone challenges your client's fantasy. Karoline blinked once, then again, but her hands remained at her sides. She knew exactly what this was. An attempt not just to humiliate her, but to diminish her publicly, to paint her as nothing more than a loudmouth who stumbled into politics and didn't belong. She glanced at the cameras. They were still rolling. Marks leaned in. You want to be taken seriously? Then act like someone with the maturity to handle criticism, not a pundit with a microphone and a chip on her shoulder. Karoline's voice was lower this time, but each word landed like a drumbeat. Do you treat every young woman who speaks her mind this way, or just the ones who disagree with your politics? The judge hesitated for a brief moment, his eyes narrowing, not in thought, but in calculation. It was as if he hadn't expected pushback, especially not from her. I judge people based on what they say and how they behave, he replied. You've built your reputation on confrontation. Don't act surprised when you find yourself confronted. The courtroom door swung open again, this time with more force. A uniformed officer entered, followed by another man in a gray jacket. They moved quietly, taking positions near the back, without a word, simply watching. Marks noticed them but kept talking. Let me be clear, this isn't about silencing you. It's about reminding you and everyone watching that words have consequences. You can't just say whatever you want without expecting pushback. Karoline tilted her head. So this hearing is about sending a message. It's about accountability. Marks corrected. You mean intimidation. Marks stared at her, offering no response. Just a thin, knowing smile as he looked back down at the papers before him. But the quiet presence of the men in the back had shifted the air in the room. What Marks didn't know was that while he believed he was making an example of Karoline, he had no idea what was coming next. As the judge continued his display of power from the bench, a very different scene was unfolding beyond the polished walls of the courtroom. Downstairs, in a windowless administrative corridor, 2 federal agents stood, their clipped ID badges barely catching the dim light. A sealed manila folder rested between them. Their jackets bore no official insignia, but anyone paying attention would recognize exactly who they were. One of them, Agent Keating, checked his watch. They told us to wait for the signal. The other, a woman named Laura Hendricks, nodded without looking up. She was focused on the folder in her hands. Inside it, nearly a year's worth of sealed affidavits, subpoenaed communications, and testimonies from former staff within Judge Ronald Marks's chambers. Allegations of misconduct, financial kickbacks, and systematic abuse of power weren't new, but until this morning, no one had dared to act on them publicly. No one, until a single whistleblower cracked. That whistleblower was sitting just 3 doors down in a witness waiting room. Jillian Vargas had been Marks's judicial assistant for 2 years. She wasn't political, didn't care for headlines or ideology. She just cared about doing her job. And over time, she began noticing strange things. Late-night meetings, case files disappearing before hearings, long phone calls from private numbers after court adjourned. But it wasn't until she uncovered that Marks had accepted thousands of dollars in campaign contributions routed through fake legal firms, then dismissed a case directly tied to one of those donors, that she knew she couldn't stay silent. Blowing the whistle hadn't been easy. Her first complaint went nowhere. The second vanished without a trace. Only when she went directly to a contact at the Department of Justice. Off the record, did things start to move. Slowly, quietly, until now. Upstairs, Judge Marks was growing bolder by the minute, oblivious of the fact that his own courtroom, his personal stage, was under surveillance. Agents in the back watched. Jillian monitored from a screen nearby. A quiet team in an unmarked vehicle across the street recorded every word. In the hallway, Laura's earpiece buzzed. "It's time." She turned to Keating. "Let's go." Inside the courtroom, Karoline hadn't moved, but her expression had shifted. What began as discomfort had turned into something else, detached awareness. She wasn't afraid anymore. She was watching. Marks was pacing now, voice rising. "There's a trend I've noticed. People in your position confuse attention with integrity. Stirring up a crowd doesn't make you right. It just makes you loud." Alan stepped in once more. "Your Honor, this is inappropriate. This is not a platform for your political commentary. If this continues, we'll have no choice but to escalate this to the Judicial Review Board." Marks let out a dry, sharp laugh. "You think they don't already know how I operate?" A soft knock echoed from the side door. The bailiff looked up, then slowly opened it. Laura and Keating stepped in, calm, deliberate. No rush, no announcement, just presence. Judge Marks froze mid-sentence, his frown deepening. "Excuse me, this is a closed hearing." Keating stepped forward, his voice low but unwavering. "Judge Ronald Marks, we have a federal warrant for your arrest." Gasps rippled through the room. A woman in the front row dropped her pen. Another man instinctively reached for his phone, then hesitated, frozen in place. Marks looked as if someone had slapped him. His eyes darted to courtroom cameras, then to the reporters, and finally to Karoline. "This is a setup," he snarled. "This is political." Keating didn't flinch. "Sir, you are being charged with obstruction of justice, accepting illegal campaign contributions, tampering with court records, and abuse of judicial authority. Please step away from the bench." Alan whispered something to Karoline, but she didn't react. Her gaze was locked on the man who had spent the morning trying to dismantle her. Now, he was being handed his own indictment. But before anyone could fully absorb what was happening, Marks gripped the edge of the bench, steadied himself, and said something that stunned the entire room. He didn't step back. Instead, he leaned forward, knuckles white against the wood, his voice dropping into a near growl. "This is what happens when you hold people like her accountable. They find some washed-up assistant with a grudge, dig through your trash, and call it justice." Keating didn't react. He simply opened the warrant folder and began reading it aloud, word for word. Meanwhile, Laura shifted slightly, scanning the room, alert to every movement. But Marks wasn't done. "You think this is real?" he shouted. "You think this isn't about politics?" She walked in here with cameras rolling, with a media team waiting for this exact moment. You're all watching performance, and she's a lead. He pointed directly at Karoline, and that's when something shifted. Karoline stepped forward, her heels clicking against a tile in the otherwise silent room. Even the agents paused. "I didn't ask for this," she said firmly. "I didn't walk in here hoping to see you in handcuffs. But I won't apologize for standing up to you, either." Mark scoffed. "Oh, please, spare me the hero monologue." She didn't blink. "You tried to humiliate me. Not with facts, not with law, but with personal attacks disguised as questions. You wanted me to stumble, to shrink. That doesn't make you powerful. That makes you afraid." For a fleeting moment, something flickered across his face. Not regret, but recognition. She was right, and he knew it. "You have no idea what it's like to sit in this chair," he snapped. "You think it's about ego? It's survival. Every week, I get threats from both sides. Every case, I'm expected to pick the right politics before I even hear the facts. Do you think that's justice?" Marks demanded. Karoline didn't answer. She didn't need to, because this wasn't about law anymore. It was about exposure. He had torn off his own mask. From the gallery, someone whispered, "He's admitting it." Judge Marks scanned the crowd, suddenly aware of how many people had just witnessed his unraveling. The cameras, the reporters, the murmurs. The weight of it all landed squarely on him. There was no controlling the narrative anymore. Laura stepped closer. "Sir, we need you to comply." He stared at her as if he hadn't heard, then suddenly turned to the court clerk. "Stop typing." The clerk froze, looking paralyzed. "No one's going to write this like it happened," Marks muttered. "They'll turn it into a movie. I'll be the villain. She'll be the angel. That's how this works now." Allen raised a hand gently. "Your Honor, don't make this harder than it needs to be." Marks let out a low, bitter laugh. "I gave 30 years to the system. Do you know how many people I protected? How many compromises I had to make just to keep it moving? And how many did you bury along the way?" Karoline asked quietly. He looked at her, opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Keating stepped forward, his voice firm. "Judge Ronald Marks, place your hands in front of you." This time, Marks didn't resist. He stood still, robes shifting as he raised his arms. Laura moved behind him, snapping the cuffs into place. The metallic click echoed through the room like a gunshot. As they turned him toward the exit, he locked eyes with Karoline one last time. "This is a witch hunt," he muttered. The courtroom buzzed. Some gasped, others murmured. A few clapped, but stopped quickly. Even among those who wanted to see him fall, there was something unsettling about the scene. Karoline exhaled, slow and steady. But even with Marks gone, what came next would test her more than any courtroom ever could. The room emptied in slow waves. Like the air had thickened, and no one quite knew how to move through it. People lingered in hushed clusters, unsure whether they had just witnessed justice or something messier. The judge's bench sat empty now, the chair still slightly turned from where Marks had stood moments earlier. It looked strange, like a throne someone had fled. Karoline remained standing, arms folded lightly across her chest. She didn't look triumphant. She looked tired. Allen placed a hand on her arm. "We should go. Cameras will be waiting." "I know," she replied, barely above a whisper. They exited through the side hallway, avoiding the main entrance. The court had offered them a private way out, not as a courtesy, but to contain the chaos. As they walked, they passed by Jillian Vargas. At first, Karoline didn't recognize her, just a young woman standing alone. With a scarf wrapped too tightly around her neck and trembling hands clutching a tote bag, Jillian spoke up. "Miss Leavitt." Karoline turned. Their eyes met. Jillian looked both terrified and determined. "I'm the reason the agents came today," she said. "I worked for him. I saw too much. I kept quiet too long." Karoline stepped closer. "You did the right thing. I'm sorry you had to carry that." Jillian shook her head. "You stood there while he came after you. You didn't back down. I don't think I could have done that." "You already did," Karoline said gently. "You spoke up. That matters more than you know." Jillian smiled, just barely, then turned and walked away. Outside, the weather had shifted. Low-hanging clouds made the air feel damp, heavy with the promise of rain. Reporters clustered behind barriers, cameras flashing as Karoline stepped onto the courthouse stairs. She stood her ground. A voice from the crowd shouted, "Karoline, what do you say to people who think this was all staged for publicity?" She didn't hesitate. "I say they weren't in that room." Another question followed. "Do you think Marks was targeting you because of your politics?" Karoline paused. "I think he was targeting anyone who challenged the control he thought he had. Today, I happened to be the one standing in his way." Shutters clicked in sync. Some reporters nodded. Others just kept recording. Inside the courthouse, the investigation was already in motion. Seized hard drives, boxes of files, forensic teams combing through years of rulings. News vans broadcast live coverage, filling in the gaps with speculation. The headlines varied. Judge arrested in shocking courtroom twist. Karoline Leavitt holds her ground. Judge let out in handcuffs. Public humiliation turned political. Courtroom drama goes viral. Social media exploded. Clips from the hearing were everywhere. Some framed Karoline as a target of a deep-rooted political machine. Others accused her of playing the victim. As always, The country was split, but in a quiet suburban home in Nashua, a retired court reporter named Martin Finn watched the footage on his tablet. He had covered Marks in his early years, back when the judge was sharp, measured, and fair. What he saw now was a man consumed by his own sense of control. Power had a way of warping even the brightest minds. He turned to his wife and said, "She didn't flinch. That girl didn't flinch once." But what Martin didn't know, and what Karoline kept buried beneath every calm sentence, was that behind that podium, her hands had been shaking. Not from fear, from anger, from frustration, from the sting of standing still while someone tried to erase years of her work with a few smug comments. But Karoline also knew this wasn't the end. It was just the opening act of something bigger, harder, and far more public. The next 48 hours didn't slow down. If anything, they escalated. Every major news outlet carried the footage. A sitting judge arrested mid-hearing, indicted in front of cameras, while young political figures stood stoic and unwavering. It was television gold. The internet ran wild with theories, edits, hashtags. One clip of Karoline's calm response. Asterisk. So this hearing is about sending a message? Asterisk. Racked up over 4 million views in a day. Some saw her as a symbol of resilience. Others accused her of orchestrating the entire moment. The truth, as usual, lay somewhere in between. But most people didn't care about that. They wanted a narrative. They wanted a side to pick. At home, Karoline stayed mostly offline. She wasn't hiding, just watching, listening, processing. That night, she sat at her mother's kitchen table in Hookset, a hot mug of tea untouched in front of her. The TV hummed at low volume. Across from her, Marlene knitted slowly. "You handled yourself well," her mother said, not looking up. Karoline offered a tired smile. "I almost lost it." "But you didn't." Silence stretched between them. Then Marlene added, "He didn't think you'd stand there and take it. He expected a meltdown, something he could point to later and say, 'Asterisk, see? Just another emotional kid.'" Asterisk, Karoline nodded. "I thought about walking out, just standing up and leaving." "Why didn't you?" She stared down at the mug. "Because if I had, it would have made it easier for him to rewrite the whole moment." Her mother didn't respond. She didn't need to. Meanwhile, the legal world was buzzing. The Judicial Conduct Committee released a brief but direct statement confirming that the investigation into Marks had been underway for months. They received multiple complaints, some recent, others buried deep. The final push had come from Jillian Vargas, whose identity was now public. Her bravery sparked a nationwide conversation about judicial accountability. On national television, a panel of legal analysts debated what had gone wrong. Marks had too much autonomy for too long, one said. He got used to not being questioned. Another added, "It's not about politics. It's about power." A third chimed in, "Unchecked authority erodes balance." Back in Manchester, courthouse staff scrambled to pick up the pieces. Every case Marks had touched in the past 2 years was now under review. Some rulings might be overturned. Others retried. It was a mess. A necessary one, maybe, but a mess all the same. And in Karoline's inbox, the messages poured in: supporters, detractors, media invitations, speaking requests. Some called her brave, others reckless, and some said both. Her name was now everywhere, whether she wanted it or not. One email caught her eye. From asterisk Jillian's subject asterisk, "You shouldn't have had to go through that body asterisk, but I'm glad you did. Not for you, but for the rest of us who were scared to say something." Karoline replied within minutes. Asterisk, "You weren't the one who stayed silent. You were the one who saved the room." Asterisk still, not everyone was happy. Late-night commentators accused her of benefiting from the drama. Political rivals suggested the entire event had been staged for sympathy and exposure. One even called it asterisk a theater stunt wrapped in legal drama. Asterisk, but the footage told a different story. You couldn't fake the shock on Marks's face. You couldn't rehearse the precise moment federal agents stepped in as he raised his voice. You couldn't manufacture the silence that followed. And yet, as the noise grew louder, Karoline knew she had to make a choice. Stay reactive or take control of what came next. 3 weeks later, She sat in a modest studio chair across from veteran journalist Colleen Draper at a local station in Concord. It wasn't a primetime network interview. She had turned all those down. Too much spectacle. Too many pre-approved talking points. This was different. Quieter. A conversation, not a performance. The lights came up. Cameras rolled. Colleen adjusted her glasses. Karoline, thank you for being here. Thanks for having me. Let's start with the question everyone's asking. When you walked into that courtroom, did you know something bigger was about to happen? Karoline didn't smile, didn't lean into theatrics. She answered plainly. No, I knew the complaint was weak. I expected cheap shots, maybe some media bait, but I didn't know federal agents were waiting in the hallway. Colleen nodded. When Judge Marks got personal, bringing up your background, your faith, your upbringing, what was going through your mind? I wanted to leave, Karoline said, her tone firm. But I also knew if I left, it would be framed as me backing down. That hearing wasn't about facts. It was about power. And the one thing I learned fast in politics is, if you give bullies the last word, they'll rewrite the whole chapter. Colleen sat back slightly, letting the silence carry the weight of that line. Do you think what happened with Marks was personal or political? Both, Karoline said. Personal in the way he tried to dismantle my character. Political in the way he used the courtroom like a stage. He wasn't just trying to embarrass me. He wanted to send a message to anyone who sounded like me, looked like me, or challenged him. Across the country, the fallout was still unfolding. The Judicial Ethics Board had already suspended several of Marks's past rulings. A formal committee had been established in New Hampshire to review how judicial complaints were handled. It wasn't fast, but it was real. Something was moving. Karoline hadn't made any big speeches. No press conferences. No viral videos. She let others speculate. Her focus was elsewhere. Colleen leaned forward. You've stayed relatively quiet since that day. Why? Karoline hesitated. Because I didn't want to turn this into a brand. I didn't want to sell coffee mugs with my face on them or run ads pretending I survived something no one else could have handled. I stayed quiet because I was angry, and I didn't want to speak from anger. Colleen raised an eyebrow. What would you say now looking back? Karoline exhaled. I'd say power without accountability is dangerous. And sometimes the only thing that exposes it is standing still and refusing to flinch. The interview ended with a handshake, and as the lights dimmed, Karoline finally let her shoulders drop. Backstage, her phone buzzed. A message from Alan. You did good. Simple. Honest. Exactly what it needed to be. That night, she drove back to her apartment just outside Bedford. The roads were mostly empty. No paparazzi. No protesters. Just a quiet return to something that felt like normal. At a red light, she thought about Jillian, about how one scared assistant had tipped over an entire system simply by choosing to speak when silence was safer. About how justice didn't always arrive with fireworks. Sometimes it slipped in through a side door while the cameras were pointed somewhere else. She didn't feel heroic. She felt aware. And that awareness was the lesson she hoped people would carry from the chaos. That speaking the truth doesn't always look brave. Sometimes it looks awkward, shaky, uncomfortable. Sometimes it feels like losing, but it still matters. Because sometimes all it takes to shift the balance is one person who refuses to play along. So if you've ever been in a room where someone tried to shrink you, silence you, or humiliate you, remember this. Your silence isn't safety. And your voice, even shaking, might be the thing that changes everything. Thanks for watching, and subscribe my channel for other videos.